And I now have the great pleasure to introduce the first discussion this morning, which will be on European democracy. How can we make it future-proof? It is really an honor to welcome Frans Timmermans, the first Vice President of the European Commission, and by the way, one of the lead candidates in the next European Parliament elections on stage. Please help me welcome Frans Timmermans. Let me first of all say thank you so much for being with us. I know that Wednesday mornings are always really busy because it's when the College of Commissioners meets. But I really, when we prepared this and we knew it was on democracy, we couldn't think of a better person than you to be here with us this morning, because I mean you've really been a tireless advocate around all issues of democracy, be it around the rule of law, but also really a much more active engagement with citizens. And in fact, you have an annual colloquium on fundamental rights that just concluded yesterday. I actually had the pleasure of moderating one of the sessions. It was excellent, and the colloquium this year was dedicated to democracy, which I think is very timely. And I was wondering, just to kick us off, if you could speak a little bit about what were sort of the key insights that came out of the colloquium.
One thing that really struck me is the introduction by Anne Applebaum immediately on our first day of the colloquium, where she said that our day and age can be compared, no, let me put it differently, the changes we see in our society in terms of communication can be compared to the invention of the printing press in the 15th century, saying that this led to complete reshuffling of relationship between people, challenging institutions, and of course then it led into 100 years of religious wars. I hope we're not going to revisit that, but I think the point she was making that inventions can lead to a complete reshaping of society is the fundamental point that democracy needs to deal with today in the fourth industrial revolution. And I think that if I look back at what was said during the colloquium, much of what people were reflecting on is how we reinvent or how we reinvigorate democracy under these new circumstances. And if I sort of sense the atmosphere right, somewhere in between desperation and hope. A lot of worries about the shrinking space for civil society, about authoritarian reflexes, left, right, and center, but also a lot of hope because of the mobilization of civil society. So I think we've got our work cut out for us.
And can I just ask, I mean, I think what Anne Applebaum, I wasn't there, but I think what she is alluding to when she says that essentially sort of the digital age, if she compares that to the arrival of the printing press, is, I mean, have we been a little bit naive? Because some of the assumptions early on was that social media would lead to much more engagement and we would have a better quality of democracy simply because it would enable so many more people to participate and to become part of the process. Why were we so poor at anticipating that information could become weaponized, essentially, which is what we're seeing? Why was that? Why were we so slow? Why couldn't we see that coming?
I think because this is simply something we've never seen before in human history, and we're not even today coming to terms with what artificial intelligence can mean for our society. So I think we need the best and brightest to think about this. Because in other parts of the world, in China, this is only approached in a technological way. How can it benefit our society and how can it increase our control over society? In the United States, it's very much linked to the position of big tech in the economy. And I think we as Europeans will have a duty to never neglect the moral aspects of what's happening. How do we make sure our values are not threatened but reinforced by these new technological developments? Because if I come back to the issue of democracy, I think the defining phrase in this probably generation, given all these changes, is take back control. And I think, it's not just in Brexit. I think the issue of taking back control is very much alive in all European societies. And a democracy that does not manifestly show that it can help individual citizens and communities to take back control will be sort of beaten by other political systems that do promise that they will take back control, even if taking back control, in their view, starts with full disruption of society. So this idea, which is a traditional part of revolutionary radicalism to the left and to the right, that you need destruction as a creative instrument, I think is something that needs to be challenged by what I would more see as the evolutionary vision of politics. And democracy has a fundamental challenge here, because if people believe that democracy doesn't deliver for them anymore, they will look elsewhere. They will look elsewhere. And even if they don't believe that elsewhere will provide the solutions, at least by choosing radical politics, people will make sure that those who are feeling very comfortable today, tomorrow will feel as uncomfortable as they do. So if you can't, help with your vote or with your action to create positive results, at least you can help those who are in power and you see as detached from you to suffer just as much as you do. And that's I think, one of the biggest challenges we face today.
So in a way, it is a backlash maybe against elites, a backlash against technocrats. What do we do about this? How can we restore trust in the system?
Well, first of all, I think there is what I see following many intellectuals thinking about this and following the debates we're having, and we're doing it again this morning, is that it's also about language. I'm fascinated by language, and we tend to take over the words used by those who want to destruct and sort of be autocritical with words that are not just about criticism, but about challenging the very system. So I see, intimidated journalists. I see intimidated intellectuals. Oh my God, we can't neglect the populist wave. No, we can't. But it doesn't mean you have to sort of embrace the jargon and embrace the images as though elites were the ones taking over and neglecting the etc., etc. Because the interesting thing is that if populists anywhere, when they gain power, the main thing they do is to make sure that they and people with them certainly profit from that, even financially. Trump crying, "Who are the elites? Who are the elites? We're the elites." Yeah, exactly. And I'm yet to see a swamp being drained by the very pond life that profits from the swamp.
I'm very glad that you raised this issue, because one of the points that we have on the agenda and will be discussed today is what we call plutocracy. I mean, it is essentially the concentration of also now political power among people who are already very wealthy or who use political office to become very wealthy. Because when you hear populist, you somehow think there's a political agenda, but maybe there's something going on that doesn't meet the eye, that we are being sort of naive about.
But it's also how societies change. If you look at people who came to power like Berlusconi or Trump, they first became big in show business. So they acquired a public support or public acknowledgement through other means, not through politics. And I think this is a trend you can see elsewhere as well. So how do we just say, oh, that's bad, that shouldn't happen? No, we should understand why people relate earlier to people who are becoming known or famous through audiovisual media or through entertainment, and why they don't relate to other politicians. I think we are in a post-paternalistic society, and politics is still very much organized along paternalistic lines, and especially European politics. And we need to rethink that. I also believe that politics is very much still oriented towards an ideological base, which to most people in society has no meaning anymore. People are idealistic, but not necessarily ideological. And I think this is also something that democracy needs to rethink. You know, you see it in many countries that voting patterns are no longer determined by so much by your social status or by your community, but far more by, do I trust this woman or man to represent me? And you know, we need to be thinking about what that means of how we organize democracy. Another issue is, you know, you watch TV programs, you know, Britain's Got Talent or The Voice, etc. There people can express their opinion in a direct way, and expressing their opinion with the new means of communication can also immediately lead to something changing. And in democracy, you're asking people, in the case of us in Europe, you know, vote once every 5 years, and then we'll do, sometimes in a paternalistic way, we'll make sure your vote will be counted. But democracy will, you know, the instrument of permanent consultations can be instrumentalized to retain and increase powers. This is what you see Viktor Orban doing in Hungary, and that creates the image of a vibrant democracy and of a participative democracy. But we then don't look at the question that's being put. As I said to him at some point, when he said to me, look, I asked the people and the people think this, etc. Well, I said to him, I could also go, if I wanted to win the elections in the Netherlands, ask a very simple question to the Dutch people. Very simple. Say, dear Dutch people, do you want to spend your euros in the Netherlands, or do you want us to give it to Viktor Orban? And I can tell you what the answer will be. But it would be completely irresponsible politics. It would be completely irresponsible politics. Because the real story is structural funds help develop new societies, new economies, and that's very good for the Dutch economy, an export-oriented economy. So the real story is that we're helping ourselves by helping other member states in the European Union. But if you want to be, if you want to sort of increase your popularity, you frame it in another way. It's irresponsible, but as long as it's effective, you know, it won't stop people of doing it.
That's a very good point. Thank you so much. I was earlier this year at the Web Summit, and in many discussions sort of around disinformation, democracy, and there was really sort of a consensus that democracy has been hacked, is how they put it. And when I look at it, I think we feel it, but then of course there is an overriding trend that democracy and freedom around the world has been weakening now for 12 years. It's really a very strong trend that I think we've been a little slow to catch, and we feel disrupted. But I often wonder about all the sort of countries that are maybe just on the cusp of becoming more democratic and now have these digital tools used essentially against freedoms and against civil society and against opposition parties. What do we do about this?
Yeah, I think, you know, if you look at the previous industrial revolutions, so public authorities, if you want to call them that, always take time to adapt to the new situation. And until that time, a lot of disruption can happen. And as, you know, if you look back, what did Teddy Roosevelt do in the United States when, you know, statehood, public governance was taken over by robber barons because they became so powerful that the state was no longer in control? He introduced legislation that would allow states to take control not disrupting market economy, but setting limits to the actions by cutting them up, by coming with antitrust laws, etc. I think we're going to see a moment like that as well in terms of how we handle the digital new economy. I think this is fast approaching. Look, The Economist did a wonderful piece about this. I think I read something in the New York Times as well over the weekend, where actually the same ideas are coming back that were also used in the third industrial revolution. And I think we at the European Commission should be thinking about this a lot, because the onus will be on us to come up with the best possible ideas. I went to a conference in Canada 2 years ago where big tech, Silicon Valley, was represented, and they were still at the time very much in this libertarian attitude. Government is stupid, you don't understand us, we will take care of ourselves, society will take care of it. And my point has always been to them, any politician in responsibility, her or his first duty is to protect the citizens. And if you and what your products are seen as a threat to the citizens, we will react. And either you're part of that, and then we might get it right, or you're not part of that, but that will not stop us to regulate. I don't want to sound like the Borg, but you will be regulated, is something that I think is clear if public authorities see that their citizens and the liberties of their citizens are threatened by these developments. So my call is on the sector, and we've seen recently how they can misbehave. I think we're all now fed up with the sanctimonious attitude of Mr. Zuckerberg, if you see what his organization's been doing. But, you can be part of this, or you will be regulated, and we'll do it in the best possible way we can imagine, but we will not have your input. And I think this should be a very strong message to big tech and to what is happening worldwide. And also, we need to lose any form of being naive. This is the cheapest form of warfare. This is Vladimir Putin can do this on the cheap. He doesn't have to build big ships, etc., and he can disrupt our societies just with a number of troll factories if we don't have our defenses in order. And we still need to do a lot to get that in order. And we also need to have a debate publicly, because the reaction is always, especially on the libertarian side or the more radical side, you're limiting the freedom of the press. Well, let's see. Let's have a discussion about that. But I want to come back to my initial point of taking back control. It's not just because of new technologies. It's also because of people who are so distraught that they don't feel in control of their own destinies anymore. Then they are also susceptible to be seduced by mythology, by conspiracy theories. If you follow the web, any conspiracy theory, even the most idiotic, gets followers because people are so insecure. I think it's an expression of fundamental or existential insecurity. And if we don't get that, if we don't correct that, if we don't help people regain control of their destinies, then democracy will lose. I have no doubt. Authoritarian systems can beat us if people don't have the feeling that we help them regain control of their destinies.
Very important point that you make, and on the essentially using digital tools on the cheap to disrupt democracy. Just wanted to mention we recently looked into this, and it costs about, there are now cyber mercenaries, so companies that you can hire to disrupt democracy. So it costs around 50,000 euros to destroy a journalist's reputation. It costs around 170,000 euros to organize a street protest. This is all possible now, and it's of course a formidable threat. With your permission, can we take one or two questions from the floor? Who wants to ask a question? Oh, it's a shy audience. Then, yeah, the lady over here. Please introduce yourself.
Hi, good morning. Thank you for your discussion. My name is Ana Albulescu. I'm an ERC trainee. And my question is related to your last point. How do you deal with this existential crisis and insecurity in citizens? Thank you.
I think, regaining control has a lot to do with, for instance, robots. I have a job, robots are coming, my job is gone. So where do I go? And if we do not have a convincing narrative, not just a story, but proof that robots can actually create jobs instead of taking jobs away, and better jobs, better protected jobs. If we don't get that right and we just let the market take care of it and see wherever this takes us, then you will not be able to convince people. Secondly, it's about socioeconomic security. It's also about identity. There is, all across Europe, there is an existential fear of where is my identity going? Am I still going to be part of a community? What is that community? How is that going to develop? How do I relate with other communities? And this is being manipulated in political circles to say that there are people who are going to take away your identity. And then democracy is being reformulated in terms of cultural democracy, in the sense the cultural majority should dictate and the rest should adapt or leave. And that, to Europe, that would be the end of European society. In Europe, we are all minorities. Even the Germans, on the European scale, are a minority. And if we don't see a society as vibrant, having minorities, then we are disrupted. But to give people comfort in their identity, that their identity is not threatened, is a huge, huge effort that starts with education. So socioeconomic security, identity, then the very fundamental physical security, terrorism, violent crime, threats from outside. And there I think Europe can have the quickest wins, because there we can provide collective responses to this threat. So when we start with the physical security, then look at the socioeconomic security, then look at the identity security, and then also make sure that new tech helps and strengthens society, doesn't disrupt society, I think these would be the avenues. And I say this in full knowledge of the fact that this is going to be incredibly complex. But as in any industrial revolution, institutions either adapt or become obsolete. Because the one reason why we had religious wars in the 15th century and beyond is because the main institution of the day refused to adapt, and only adapted, which is the Catholic Church, and only adapted after all this disruption. So let that be a lesson. Let's adapt our institutions to face these challenges instead of waiting for them to be disrupted by those who see disruption as a primary goal. Mr. Bannon and all the ones who think like him have a very clear idea. Break everything, and then from chaos, we can reorganize it along nationalist lines. And that is something that might work in some parts of the world, but given our history and given our composition, for Europe, this would be extremely long-term disruptive and destructive.
Very good point. Thank you so much. I see Nick Gowing's hand, please, and introduce yourself.
Morning, Nick Gowing, founder and co-author of the Thinking the Unthinkable project. I was on that platform 2 years ago, saying similar things to that with my colleague Chris Langdon. But I'm thinking, listening to you, and we would 110% agree with you. How brave do you think people are to recognize what you've just been saying? 2 years ago, you were talking about the European Union being on the brink.
Yes.
And 10 years ago, when I was still a journalist working for the BBC at the Reuters Institute, I wrote a paper saying the new vulnerability of power, politics, and systems from the new public information space. And people wanted to take me out of the room because they didn't believe it would happen. They believed power would still be in the hands of those who were elected and appointed. It is very different now. Are they waking up? Are they brave enough to actually understand and accept what you've just said?
Well, of course, I've expressed my worries, as you know. I've done so for a couple of years. It came as a shock to my own country when I said 4 years ago the European Union could break up. It's not unthinkable anymore. And I think since then, there's nothing that contradicts that. So that's one side. The other side, however, is we have a very, very strong civil society in Europe that is not yet fully aware of its power to redress things. And I take a lot of courage from that, a lot of optimism from that. So I think two groups in our societies that are directly threatened by these developments are women and young people. I honestly believe that once women wake up to this reality and see that those who propose to take us to the past also mean proposing to take women back 100 years, once they see that, there will be a huge mobilization. And I don't know what political form it will take, because much of the mobilization today in our member states keeps distance from political parties. And this is something political parties should be thinking about. But there is a potential for mobilization. And with young people, it's exactly the same. The only question I have is, will this mobilization sort of create a radical middle? Because I think the biggest threat to democracy in Europe is the erosion of the middle. Will it create a radical middle, or will it create radical opposites that will just confront each other and not find common ground? But those people who are not yet woken up to this reality are generally people who like compromises, who like to come to terms with other people to find solutions. And here again, I go back to this point of technology. Algorithms are really preventing us from doing this. The nature of algorithms is that they confirm your views. And the nature of the development of that is that we all find our own little comfortable bubble where we only speak with people who already agree with us. I'm afraid this might be also a bit the case today. And the only way a democracy can be vibrant if it does not avoid confrontation with people who disagree with you. And I think the biggest mistake, and let me end on that, the biggest mistake democratic parties can make is to give up on the people who for now have moved away from them and moved to the more radical authoritarian form of politics. It is out of desperation, it is out of disappointment that they do this. So stop disappointing them, give them reasons to hope, and they will come back. Because the ideologues on the radical, on the authoritarian side, do not carry the ideological day. They carry the vocal day, they carry the desperation, but they do not carry a vision of society that is broadly shared by society. So my hope comes from civil society. And the fear of the autocrats is with civil society. It is no accident that they're constantly trying to throttle it, constantly trying to shrink the space of civil society. It's because they fear civil society. And let that be a source of hope for all of us.
Excellent. And I think, unfortunately, we have to leave it here, yes, because I know you need to go to the college. But I just want to say thank you so much for spending the time with us, and also for really calling it out on some issues. You are a very courageous, principled policymaker, and I think we need more of that. And I personally could not have thought of a better way to start a discussion on democracy and governance than having you with me on the couch here this morning. And I really want to warmly thank you, and I ask all of you to join in a round of applause. Thank you so much. Thank you. I really appreciate it.